So today I'm going to talk about the life of Emanuel Swedenborg. Some of you will know him, some of you might not, and surely when I started to studying about his life, I found out a lot of stuff that I didn't know about him. So I'm going to try and share some of his life when he was alive, and then some of the communications and how he was kind of mentioned in some of the books from Spiritism, especially in the Spiritist review. That's where we find a lot of information about him. So who was he? He was a descendant from a very wealthy mining family. He was born in Sweden, in Stockholm. So he was kind of from a very well-known family. His dad became a bishop of a Lutheran church. So that's kind of how he was brought up, the religion that it kind of was the basis of his life, and was the name of his mom there as well. His dad was called Jasper Swedenborg, so his name was changed, and I'm going to explain why his surname was changed and how that came about as well. He studied in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. So because he was wealthy, he could go to kind of where all kind of important people used to go to study and get kind of cultural and knowledge that supported him in his life. He was given a noble title by the Queen Ulrica. He became very close to her. There is a passage in the Spiritist review where he talks about an interaction he had with the Queen. She would call him for counsel. She would call him for support as well. And she's the one that changed his surname when he became a nobleman to Swedenborg. He was born in 1688 in Sweden, and he left Earth on 1772 in London. So if you go to Bloomsbury, I'm going to show a picture towards the end, there's an institution that's named after him, and he has lots of followers around the world to this date. But I'm going to explain why he has and what kind of what good things he brought to us, both on a spiritual level but also on a material level as well, and an intellectual level. He was known as what we can call him a universal genius, and I'm going to kind of bring some of the things he did during his lifetime that proves that the guy was definitely a genius. So he was a submarine designer before it even existed. So there was a draft of a design of a submarine that he did in 1714. About 30 odd years later was the first time that one was actually created. So he had kind of the drafts for that. He was a psychologist 140 years before Freud. He had a draft of a kind of an article where he was studying and analyzing feelings, and he talks about this in some of his books as well. He was an aeronautical engineer. This is a plane that he designed before the Wright brothers, and for the Brazilians also before what's his name? Santos-Dumont. Sorry for forgetting. I've just committed a capital sin. So he designed an airplane, or kind of a flying machine. That's how he called it. Even before it existed, he knew it couldn't fly because of the aeronautical dimensions of it, but he said, it's going to be the draft for many others to come and design and follow after me. And he did a lot of other things that I'm going to kind of just bring the signs to show what he was, and you can try and second guess some of them. He was a mathematician, he was a geologist, he was a metallurgist, he was a mineralogist, crystallographer. I'm looking at my cheat sheets here, otherwise I wouldn't be able to find it. He was an anatomist, a botanist, scientist, physicist, cosmologist, astronomer, philosopher. There's a lot more. He was a theologist. He was an author. He wrote many, many books. He was a inventor. Thank you. They make sense then. He was a legislator, so he worked kind of with law as well. He was a mining engineer, kind of. He studied that too because of his family. He was an economist, he was an editor, and he was a writer and a poet. And I'm not making this up. The records will show you. If you study his lifetime, there will be records of all of that. So yes, he was definitely a universal genius for being able to produce all of this. And by the age of 26, many of these achievements, and he was working through it throughout his lifetime, and traveled a lot and studied a lot to be able to do it. And I couldn't forget John.
Really?
He was a musician as well.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Gosh.
So, yes. Out of this world, all the contributions he made. But something happened in his mid-50s that kind of changed his life, and he became even more well-known. Before that, he was already recognized for the books he wrote, for the work he did. When he was an inventor as well, I forgot to mention something. He supported Stockholm, or a city that was very close to Stockholm. They had a port, and they wanted to be able to bring some of the ships or smaller boats on shore, on top of the earth, and he invented a machine that would be able to kind of like, I don't know how you say it, but would be able to bring, yes, he would be able to bring so he's resolved a lot of problems, saved them a lot of money, because he was able to create that as well. So that's the kind of person he was. But in his mid-50s, something drastically changed with his life, and he kind of entered a spiritual crisis, and he started to kind of have intense dreams and visions, and he recorded this. He's written over 100 books, and he recorded it in a diary that is in one of his books, where he kind of talks about these dreams and visions that he had. And he had what is called, kind of from people outside of Spiritism, he had his spiritual vision opened. So we're talking about mediumship and the ability to have visions and to perceive the spiritual world. And he had this, and then he started during the daytime also having full wakefulness, and this began in 1745, although the exact circumstances surrounding it remain mysterious and a matter of debate. So he never talked about the individual occasion or what happened that this all of a sudden blossomed for him. So from this point onward, he began to record experiences of being in contact with the spiritual world. So everything he saw, the experiences he had, the spirits that came into contact with him, and he began kind of a new phase in his life where, you know, he had intense mediumship, and he was able to perceive the spiritual world, and he wanted to kind of tell everybody about this. So there are some interactions that he had with the spiritual world, and that's how he mentions them, and this is a study that Kardec did on him. So if you read the Spiritist Review of November 1859, you will be able to see Kardec talking about his life. He does kind of a little bio about him, and then he will evoke him. So he can talk to him and ask him about his life on earth, some of his kind of thought processes, some of the things that he believed and how he sees them now that he's in the spiritual world. So that's what he does. But what he is going to tell us is some interactions that he had that are historical and that prove his mediumship. So in 1759, he was at a dinner party in Gothenburg, which is about 250 miles from Stockholm, so quite far. And he started being kind of agitated and started to have visions about a fire that broke in Stockholm, which was kind of diminished, which was extinguished when it was 3 doors away from his home. So he could see the street, he could see his home, and then he saw the fire coming closer and closer, but it was extinguished when it was 3 doors away from his home. And he told everybody at the dinner party that that's what he was seeing. And 2 days later, a messenger came from Stockholm and told him exactly that had happened. So that's when they kind of started to see, and he became very popular by his mediumship. A year later, a widow of a recently deceased French ambassador is presented with a bill for a very expensive silverware that her husband had already bought and paid for, but she couldn't find the receipts. And since he was recently deceased, she went after Swedenborg to ask him for help to see whether he could try and speak to her husband to find the receipt. Otherwise, she would have been out of pocket to try and pay for it. And he does just that. He speaks to the husband tells exactly where the receipts. Oh no, sorry, he doesn't speak to the husband. After consulting with Swedenborg, she has a dream that very night where her husband appears to her and tells her exactly where the receipts are. So they are able to she doesn't have to pay the guy who's trying to trick her to get more money because the husband was deceased. And in 1761 is when Queen Ulrika asked Swedenborg to help her. She, a few years earlier, her brother had passed away, and she consulted her brother to do with matters of the state. The country was getting into disarray, and there was a party that was threatening to come into power. And she wrote to her brother to ask him for counsel. What should she do in that situation? What should she do in that case? But she never got a response, and then she found out that he had passed away. So she was curious to find out if he ever received a letter, which she hoped he would, and what would have been his response. And she consults Swedenborg, and he speaks to her brother in the spiritual world. And the brother then explains why he didn't respond, because he didn't agree with the way that she was kind of ruling at the time. But he tells Swedenborg personal information that only the two of them would have known. And that's when she trusts Swedenborg for the rest of her life. She highly regards him. And then Kardec in the Spiritist Review asks whether it was actually true, if it was actually her brother that he spoke to, and he confirms that. Because Swedenborg had a lot of enemies, just like, I guess, anyone that comes with a new idea or with a new doctrine, or has, you know, a very kind of well-known and renowned life. He had people that didn't agree with him, thought he was kind of tricking everybody, thought that he wasn't a medium, and they said that somebody had intercepted the letter to then, so then they told it to Swedenborg, and he said exactly the same. But he tells Kardec that this was a genuine interaction he had with her brother. He wrote about 60 books about theology, because his background obviously is Lutheran. He grew up kind of studying the gospel. In a lot of his books he talks about the gospel and the way he interprets the gospel as well. 21 of his books are on science and philosophy, and 3 of his books he wrote during this transitional phase, where he kind of left the sciences of the world and started to kind of be curious about the spiritual world. He also wrote a book called Heaven and Hell. We've got one in Spiritism that Kardec wrote 107 years later. So he wrote this one 107 years earlier. And in this book he talks about his kind of a full report that he gives about his experience with the spiritual world, his visions, how he would describe. There are some kind of sentences he has about how he understands heaven, hell, which I'll bring later on for you guys to look at. And he's also referred by some kind of well-known people as well, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle writes about him, and also Helen Keller, which is the blind lady. Some of you might know her. She could perceive the vibrations of sound through music, but she obviously was blind and she was deaf, but that's how she could sense the music. She also said that knowing about him and his life and his teachings changed her life and kind of shaped her for the better. So these are some people that knew him and studied his teachings. So I'm going to bring some of his teachings. Some of them will have some similarity with Spiritism, some of them won't, will actually be rather the opposite, and then Kardec will then explain his thought process and how he perceived Swedenborg when he was alive as well. So one of his teachings, he talks about correspondence, which is very difficult to understand. I certainly couldn't, so I kind of draw from it the best I could, and then I'll run through some similarities with Spiritism. In Correspondence, he says, nothing can exist anywhere in the material world that doesn't have a correspondence within the spiritual world. Because if it did, it would have no cause that would make it come into being and then allow it to continue in existence. So he's saying that whatever is in the spiritual world, there will be the same corresponding in the material world, which is a kind of similar principle to Spiritism. But he goes further and he studies, for example, what gold means, what some material objects, and he makes correspondence from that to the feelings. And I think that's where Kardec kind of questions him later, and I'll bring Kardec's response. But he will say later to Kardec that this theory of correspondence, the way he sees it now in the spiritual world, it's that it's fiction. So at the time he believed it to be true, but when he came to contact of the spiritual world after he had left Earth, he no longer believes that is the case. Everything in the material world is an effect. The causes of all effects lie in the spiritual world, which is exactly what Spiritism teaches us. And the cause of those causes in turn, which are the purposes those causes serve, lie still in a deeper heaven. So the way I interpret it probably is talking about God as the creator, but he names it a deeper heaven. And that's in one of his books called Secret of Heaven. So I brought some similarities. They are in the Spiritist book, questions 84 to 86. So where we learn, for example, that the world of spirits, or that the world of spirits could continue to exist, and the material world doesn't, or how do I explain it better? If the material world ceased to exist, the spiritual world would have continued to exist. So he kind of explains, or the spirits will explain to us, that first and foremost it's the eternal reality, which is the spiritual world, and then the transitional reality, which is the material world. So we learn that the spiritual world pre-existed the material world and survives it and everything else. So we understand that these two are independent from each other, the material and the spiritual world, yet there is a correlation between them, for they react incessantly upon each other. So we talk about cause and effect, and we say that the material world is the cause, the spiritual world is the cause, whilst the material world is the effect. Some other teachings that he brought, these are not so similar to Spiritism. He believed that there is but one God and only one person, Jesus Christ. So he believed that Jesus and God were the one. And then he said that in the end comes to the conclusion that God in reality is man. So that's how he sees, and Kardec questions him. So in his view, God is present in every man. That's how he understands. He divides as well the spiritual world in three distinct places: heavens, intermediary places, and hells. So not just the one, but several. I think he talks about 3 hells, 3 heavens, and kind of the places in between would be intermediary. After death, he says, the saints voluntarily choose one of the 3 heavens, and the sinners will choose will go to one of the 3 hells, where they will never leave. So he believed in the eternal kind of punishment, which he comes to. We'll see what he says, but the first message he gives, Kardec was thinking of evoking him, and he tells that in the Spiritist Review. And before he thinks, he comes in a session earlier, and he gives a spontaneous message. And on that message, he's very worried to say that, I've made some mistakes, but the one that I regard the most serious, it's about kind of eternal punishment. Now I know that's not the case. So he explains it there, and then he comes back at another session to then answer Kardec's questions. So now is the time that we're going to touch on some of the things that Kardec said when he evokes him. He does that in September 1859. And then he will revise a lot of his teachings. So the first one is the 3 realms, so the 3 heavens and 3 hells. He claims that experience now has proven to him otherwise, so he drops that theory, he no longer sustains it. He returns, as promised, to answer the questions that Kardec had for him, and on his questions, on his answers to Kardec, he revises the theory of correspondence. He says that was fiction. He explains that God is not the man itself, but man is his image. So exactly like the gospel kind of tries to explain it to us. That's how he sees it now. He revises the concept of eternal punishment, and he confirms the truth about the Queen's brother advice. So Kardec asks him that question. And he said it was definitely him. He is present in a few the books in Spiritism. In the Spiritist book, he is in the message that, so when we read the prolegomena, is that how we say it?
Preface.
Yeah, so the introduction to the book, there's a very beautiful message where it's signed by a number of kind of highly regarded spirits, highly enlightened spirits, and he is one of them in that message. So that's where he's present. He's present also in the medium's book, but he's cited rather than giving a message. Somebody will cite him as, mentioning his mediumship as an example of, for example, clairvoyance and a lot of other mediumship faculties he had. And then in the Spiritist Review, he's cited many times. And then Kardec will give his own views around Swedenborg. So he will tell the bio about him and what he thinks were the positives and some of the negatives as well about him. So Kardec says he made a hardly forgivable mistake despite his experience of things from the hidden world. He blindly accepted everything the spirits said without submitting it to reason. If he had maturely weighted the pros and cons, he would have recognized the principles incompatible with logic. So things like eternal punishment, and some of the teachings and the spirits revealed to him, he took it as all. He didn't kind of try to analyze what could have been coming from, a superior spirit and what could have been coming maybe from a spirit that was a little bit more ignorant. So he took everything as kind of as face value, as true. Whilst Kardec recommends us to check and analyze and see if it's got, if we can find reason in what we are studying or teaching. But Kardec says as well, despite the errors of his system, Swedenborg does not cease to be one of the great figures whose memory will be linked to the history of spiritualism, which was the first and most zealous promoters. So he was one of the first kind of scientists that actually accepted spiritualism and studied it and was renowned and recognized for it. And there are many people to this date that follow him, either through, they have societies, they have churches, like there is a society here in London that promotes his teachings. So there's still a lot of people that follow his spirituality. And that's a picture of Swedenborg House there in Bloomsbury, if you want to kind of visit. It's a small society with, they will tell his biography. He lived in London for a long time and he died in London as well. And he was kind of in the circles of Newton, and he circulated in the same kind of groups or cultural groups. So there's a lot for us to learn about him, and we can visit. I'm 5 minutes early, so if you guys have questions, I'll be happy to.
Did you say Bloomsbury?
Yes,
is it a
Bloomsbury.
city?
Bloomsbury is close to Holborn.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, central London. Yeah, probably at that time wasn't so central, but.